Outrider, the last drop pod should be just up ahead.
Got it. Drop me here and find a site to make camp.
Better move fast, Outrider. Big storm coming.
Zahedi, I found the pod I'm going in. Looks like you're not the only one trying to get at it.
Outrider, hurry. I need to get the data from that pod before the storm hits.
Hey guys, it's been a while.
Outrider, you need to hurry. The storm is almost on us.
Scared it off. Pod's clear, come on.
Son of a bitch! These ice storms are getting more insane every day.
Edie, thought you said these pods were protected
No,
from the...
no! I have to pull this data before everything's fried. He was right.
Who?
I didn't believe it. But the anomaly, it's growing. Exponentially now. Everything we did to bring these pods down. Weapons. Seeds for crops. All of our knowledge from Earth. In the end, none of it matters. If we don't find a way to stop what's coming, there will be nowhere on this planet for us to hide.
Maybe it's time we stop hiding.
That can't be good. Shannon, do you copy? Shanna? Tiago? Bailey? Shit. Zahedi, stay with the pod. Something's wrong. Whole flocks of demon birds dropping from the sky. If they can't adapt to survive these storms, I don't want to know our odds.
The creatures here, the anomalies always mutated them fast enough before, but this shift happening now, it's too severe.
Where is everyone? I don't like this. guys have gotten yourselves eaten. Jenna! Tiago! Bailey! Where the hell are you?
Outrider, here! We took shelter in the cave.
It's another vision. They just keep getting worse.
Body rotting, split open, frozen shadows. She sees you coming.
Who?
It's too late. You can't save it. You'll try, but it'll consume you.
Jenna, I'm not going anywhere.
But you are. I'm so sorry.
Stay here. I'll clear a way back to the truck. The way to the truck's clear.
We'll be there. Outrider, we need to return to Rift Town. I know someone that might have answers about these ice storms.
Oh God, what happened? We were here just days ago.
This must be what I saw in my vision. This is only how it begins.
Shira, do you read me? Shira!
Outrider, I can hear you.
What the hell happened?
What does it look like? We thought it was just another storm, but we lost nearly everything on the surface. Anyone who couldn't move fast enough.
Where are you sheltered?
In the old sub-levels. We won't last long here. There's an elevator we rigged. It can bring you down.
Shira, what happened?
It's over. I thought the signal, the pods, the Hades whole plan, but... the anomaly destroys everything. I don't know how we'll survive this.
There might still be a way.
You! You traitor! You think we're gonna find out?
Shira, what the hell?
He's been sharing information with the insurgents, Lieutenant!
No, I have to find... No, you don't understand! No, he can save us!
Save what? Everything we've built is gone. I'm sick of your bullshit missions. All your fucking hell!
It shouldn't be delayed. I'm doing it yesterday.
Get up. Okay. Who the hell you been talking to?
Salvador. Francisco Salvador. He's with the insurgents, but he's a scientist. We just shared data.
He was trying to
And
get
you didn't
hopes and
think to tell me
dreams.
you were talking to the other side.
Listen to me.
And she didn't like it and tried to kill
What
him.
he found, it could be an answer. But he disappeared before I got the final readings. Without those,
This,
I don't...
Salvador. If he's even still alive, where do I find him?
He worked deep behind enemy lines in a place
Probably.
called Black Gulch.
Black Gulch. You don't want to go looking for that place, Outrider.
Why? What's there?
An altered. All we know is they call him the Commander. Black Gulch is his. You won't come out of there alive.
Yeah, well, nobody's coming out of this alive if no one tries. Come on.
Got a new mission, people. Zahedi knows a scientist who may have answers about these storms. We're looking for a place called Black Gulch.
No, that place. I keep seeing it as shadows, ripping, shredding. Gonna need snow treads for the truck soon.
We're here. Driftwater's up ahead.
Okay, Tiago. What am I looking for?
A boat. You'll need to find one at the harbor to get across the water. There, you should find a back way. Under the insurgents' walls.
Tiago, how do you know a way?
I was in prison there. Tortured beyond. I thought I was dead. But I managed to escape through the sewers and stole a boat. From here to the forest, and I never looked back.
The people who lived here in Driftwater, Tiago. Who were they?
An ECA settlement, before the war. There's nothing but ghosts here now.
What happened to the villagers?
There's a story of a night fisherman whose daughter would ring the harbor bell each dawn to call him home. But one night, insurgents in the fog, and the fisherman slept right through. The entire village slaughtered. When the fisherman returned and saw, he tore into the soldiers. He didn't last long. The next day, a thick fog rolled in and a figure stalked through it, with a long raincoat and bloody hook. The fisherman's ghost, driven mad by guilt, taking his revenge. The harbor bell tolled for each insurgent dead. They say you can hear the bell still tolling.
Looks like some old reports. No boats on this pier. Ah, looks like there's one over there, on that dry dock. What the hell?
Hear shots.
It's insurgents. The village isn't abandoned. It was a damn ambush. Okay. Just need to get to that boat on the dry dock and get the hell out of here. Damn
Find
it.
out.
This boat's a wreck.
The wreck.
Is that the fisherman? No. No, there's no way. That can't be some fisherman's ghost. I need to get a grip. Letting Tiago's stories get to my head.
Outrider, we're seeing something strange. A fog moving in over the river. There's a light.
Ghosts for our ghost town!
Let me through, fisherman! I have no quarrel with you.
Fisherman? I'm a goddamn ghost, you initiate. Fuck! Now, how about I turn you into one?
Straight up pinned. This ain't good. This ain't good.
No fisherman's ghost. Just an insurgent dressing up in a raincoat to scare off trespassers.
Are you so sure?
I, got a boat. Think it's time to get out of this place.
Where you go next is the furthest I've ever been. If Black Gulch is the belly of the beast, then this fortress is the Jaws. I fear for you in there, Outrider. I wish you'd reconsider.
I didn't die there being stuck in that fucking corner.
There's no one else who can do this for me. Look, if I don't come back...
You must. Or there'll be no tomorrow. For any of us.
Look at that fancy ass boat somehow works.
Up ahead, you should find the sewer tunnel I escaped through. Inside, there'll be a drain leading up to the execution yard, right beneath the Great Blade. I still remember the lifeless bodies I have to crawl over for my freedom. At this time of day, the yard should be empty. The executioners only work at sunrise.
Tiago, you sure this is the right way? I don't want a repeat of what happened in the village.
I remember it clearly. Have some faith, Outrider.
Oh, fuck.
That's some blade.
Hey! Who the fuck are you?
What the hell?
The altar! The Outrider's here. Kill this fucker! There's a bounty on their heads! Look me rich! Let's dance!
The blade must be fed!
The execution is only work at sunrise, huh? Tiago was fucking... Well, I could use a guide. Know a place called Black Gulch?
Yes, but no. You don't want to go there. But no one returns from Black Gulch, not even a great Altered.
You owe me your life, remember?
Ah, okay. I'll open the way for you.
Hey, don't I know you?
Long ago, Seth, he chose me on the battlefield to guide you to the Grand Marshal.
Oh yeah, well just like old times then.
Outrider, are you all right?
You sent me to the middle of an execution yard, and your abandoned village was full of insurgents.
I'm sorry. My memories aren't... I guess my time in that hellhole is one I prefer not to remember.
That cage, Altered, and you'll find what you're looking for. Weird one, over here.
This is a dead end. You're worse than Tiago. Do you even know where you're going?
Oh, I beg your patience. I swear it, we are close. Now look, and behold. Black Gulch. Canyon of the accursed. The unholy abyss. Vilest of cesspits. I don't dare go any further. Great altar. God, have mercy on your soul.
Zahedi, I made it. Black Gulch. Now I just need something to recognize your scientist by.
Right, of course. Should be easy. Salvador's missing a leg, gets by with a cane, but don't let your guard down. He's still an insurgent.
Got it. One leg. Should be toward the spot.
Salvador. You don't know how much I was hoping to find you alive.
I've heard such terrible, terrible things about you. How many of my people did you kill? Just to reach us?
Only the ones that tried to stop me.
That's why you're losing this war.
I know who you are too, Commander.
Commander Ereshkigal.
And whatever. You're the kind that lurks in the shadows while sending your people out to die.
My dear, can't you see? I am the shadows. Come. There's so much for us to talk about.
Why'd you do it, huh? Kill your own scientist? He was trying to save us all.
Because he didn't listen. Two paths diverge here for you. One leads to a new beginning. And the other to pain and horror.
Hey, you don't scare me.
Then you don't know me well enough. There's a reckoning coming. Bigger than this war. The insurgents, the ECA, it's all burning down. You're strong. But you could be so much more. Like all those humans you protect. It's time to bear your burden. Let them find salvation.
I don't think I'm gonna like your kind of salvation.
No, you won't. But believe me, it gets better every day.
Hey, I'm alive. Somehow.
What about Salvador? You haven't... He's dead, isn't he?
Yeah. But he wrote a dying message. I'm pretty sure it was for you. It's time for some answers.
This is an incredible find. I'll gather my equipment.
No more time.
You know what it means?
Here, listen. Salvador spent his whole life trying to find patterns in the anomaly. He thought there was some kind of wave structure that could be predicted. But recently, he insisted he'd found something. He found something. There. You see it? A null point. That's a hole in the anomaly.
Is it coordinates?
Yes. Right. There. Beyond the mountains to the north.
What's out there's Zahedi.
It could be where the anomaly originates, or where it ends. Maybe a glitch in the entire system. But whatever's there, it has to be an answer.
Gather the crew.
We're getting near the coordinates now.
Path looks rough. I'll scout ahead on foot.
Keep it quick, so we don't freeze to death, yeah?
Outrider, this gap in the anomaly, Salvador's null point, it could be anything. Be careful out there. There's no doubt the climate is responding to turmoil in the anomaly. These mountains weren't always this cold, I'm sure of it. This is a whole other level.
Hey, there's someone else here. But they're completely frozen. Looks like maybe they were Pax.
Pax? What were they doing all the way out here?
Maybe trying to find the same place we're looking for. Damn. A fallen giant. More of the big guys. They seem to be going the same way.
What do they know that we don't?
These markings painted on the rock face. Some kind of signposts? Maybe those pads will follow them. What the? Some kind of massive energy field. Can't tell what's on the other side. I'm heading toward it. Another damn blizzard. They're really starting to bite. lot of them. Were they on some kind of...
I wonder if August was on his way here when I found him in the forest. He used to mention a sanctuary, he called it.
I'm right on top of the coordinates. Architecture looks Pax all right, but guys, the blizzard, it just stopped.
What are you talking about? The storm just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, but not in here. There's some kind of energy barrier keeping it out.
Fascinating. But how?
An obelisk. Like the one August used to push back the storm. Is that what's protecting this place?
Eventually. Too late.
The hell? You're Pax.
The last Arcana. Perhaps.
Then you're the last that can do what August did. Channeling the storms, that obelisk. It's making that barrier. That's why Salvador wanted us to find you.
Used to bring Salvador these delicious candies. Did you any candies? Did you any candies?
No.
Such beautiful things once your people made. But all over. This Anmalashad is nearly done. My last Itare is crumbling to dust. Why? You come.
I came here looking for help. Look, I have no right, but that obelisk, it could save my people.
Cannot save anyone anymore. It's all right. Nothing ever really ends. Tea? Why you want to live so bad? Soon, whole planet. You should join me. Much more gentle this way.
You know, you sit here in your little bubble crying over candies. You've given up. But some Pax, they found a way to fight back. I watched my friend August give up everything for one of us.
August was alive. You saved?
No. She saved us. And then...
August believed in you. I see. Maybe a way. is one more shot. Great power from roots of Anmala. Enough for one more Iruak Etare.
You mean an obelisk? How?
Very dangerous. Many beasts now, and savages thrown back. All who go to Lost City for Anmalashad die.
Yeah, well, I don't die so easy.
Does not end how you want. Will be sacrifice. Will be pain.
I'll be back later. I gotta give little man a bath and a shower, so I should be back in about 2 hours.